Ever heard whispers about the Yakuza? They're not just a part of Japanese pop culture, they're a powerful group that operates from the shadows right up to the highest levels of power. Today we're going deep into their world. We'll explore how they started, grew so influential, and their role in Japan today. From their early days to their impact on the Japanese economy and culture, and mainly focus on the secrets of this mysterious organization. So are you ready to discover the real story of the Yakuza? Let's get started knowing the hidden truths behind these legendary figures. Well, let's head back to the Edo period in Japan, a real turning point when the Yakuza started to take shape. This was way back when, from 1603 to 1868. The Yakuza came from two kinds of groups who weren't really part of the regular crowd. First, there were the tekiya. These guys were like the traveling salesmen of the old days, moving from town to town, selling stuff that wasn't always the best quality. A lot of them were considered outsiders by others and didn't fit into the usual groups in Japan. By the early 1700s, these tekiya started sticking together under leaders, kind of like forming their own little clubs. They began to get involved in some not-so-nice activities, like fighting over areas and making people pay them to not cause trouble, especially during big festivals. Then, there were the bakuto, who were the gamblers. Gambling was a big no back then, but the bakuto did it anyway. They traveled around playing games of dice and cards, tricking people out of their money. They also had these cool, colorful tattoos, and that's something you'll still see on Yakuza members today. Besides gambling, these guys got into lending money and charging way too much for it, which is definitely not a nice thing to do. So, these tekiya and bakuto groups were the early Yakuza. And even today, some Yakuza groups still call themselves by these old names, depending on what kind of business they do. From these beginnings, they grew into a big organization that's known all over Japan. But keep in mind how these early Yakuza were more than just petty criminals, they were strategic and complex, setting the stage for the powerful organization we know today. As we got into the late 1800s, the groups that would form the Yakuza started to get their act together, turning from rough and tumble street gangs into something a lot more organized, like we discussed the samurai. One of these groups, the Yamaguchi-gumi, really stood out and eventually grew to be the biggest crime network in Japan. Imagine a bunch of outcasts coming together and setting up one of the most powerful groups in the country. It's like something out of a movie. They also started picking up some pretty intense traditions from the samurai, like a super strict code of honor and even a tough ritual called yubitsu, where they'd cut off a finger to show they were sorry for messing up or to prove their loyalty. It sounds brutal, but it was their way of keeping everyone in line and making sure everyone was dead serious about sticking to the group's rules. The Yakuza's way of mixing old samurai traditions with their own style of organized crime really set them apart from other gangs around the world. They weren't just about making money, they were about keeping honor and respect in the mix, too. It's wild how they managed to blend those old-school values with their modern-day crimes, making them a pretty unique chapter in the book of global organized crime. I have found out more of the content for Yakuza, but you know there are more crazy people like me, and they have searched deeply to write a proper book on them. Yakuza Japan's Criminal Underworld by David E. Kaplan and Alec Dubrow. And if you are also searching more on it, you can approach this book as a gold mine for Yakuza. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan was all about modernizing and getting everything centralized, which sounds great, but it actually opened up some unexpected doors for the Yakuza. With the country changing so fast, they found new playgrounds in construction, real estate, and even narcotics. They were hustling on both sides of the law, setting up businesses that were legit and others that were, well, not so much. Then came World War II, and it hit Japan hard, leaving the economy in tatters. Traditional systems just collapsed, and guess who stepped in? Yep, the Yakuza. They got into the black market, dealing in everything scarce, from food to fuel. They even started offering services that the government, struggling to rebuild, couldn't manage. It was like they were filling in the gaps, providing what people needed when no one else could. This period really showed how adaptable the Yakuza were, turning tough times into opportunities and expanding their influence more than ever. They weren't just gangsters, they were businessmen and sometimes even looked like heroes to the locals. Even though the Yakuza are known for their shady activities, they've really made themselves a part of everyday life in Japan. You'll see them pop up a lot in movies, books, and TV shows, and it's pretty mixed how they're shown. Sometimes they're the bad guys, and other times they seem more like misunderstood heroes. This has made people see them in many different ways, and not always just as villains. Besides just being in stories, the Yakuza have their hands in real, legitimate businesses, especially in things like making movies and building stuff. By being involved in these industries, it's hard to tell when they're doing something illegal and when it's just regular business. They sort of mix the good with the bad, which makes everything more complicated. And it's not just business, these guys are also kind of involved in politics, but in a behind-the-scenes kind of way. They have connections that help them influence decisions that affect a lot of people, even if we don't always see it happening right out in the open. This blend of being part bad guy and part businessman has helped the Yakuza stick around for a long time, making them a fixed part of Japan's story, even with all the efforts to cut down on their power. The Yakuza aren't just a Japanese phenomenon, they've extended their reach across the globe, becoming a major player in international organized crime. Operating in regions like Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America, they've established networks for drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and even cybercrime. Their ability to adapt to new markets and technologies has made them a formidable force in the underworld. History. What sets them apart is their skill in forming alliances with other criminal organizations. By partnering with local groups, the Yakuza expand their influence without drawing unnecessary attention. This approach has allowed them to stay active in international black markets while avoiding direct conflict with law enforcement in foreign countries. Yamanatante. Beyond illegal activities, the Yakuza have also infiltrated global financial systems. Using sophisticated money laundering operations, they funnel profits from their international ventures back to Japan, ensuring a steady flow of resources to sustain their operations. This international presence highlights the Yakuza's ability to evolve and remain relevant on a global scale. Their reach beyond Japan's borders not only makes them a concern for Japanese authorities but also for governments and agencies worldwide, cementing their place as a truly global criminal enterprise. The Japanese government has been really cracking down on the Yakuza lately. They've put in place some tough laws that make it harder for businesses to have any dealings with them. This is part of an effort to cut off the money supply to these groups, putting a big squeeze on their operations. At the same time, how people in Japan view the Yakuza is changing. The glamour that used to surround them is fading, especially among the younger crowd. The risks of being involved with the Yakuza are bigger now, and the rewards just aren't what they used to be. Joining a gang doesn't have the same appeal as it did in the past, especially with the government putting so much pressure on them. Meanwhile, other gangs in Japan, like the one Kita is in, have grown a lot. They've gone from a few members to over 100. In Japan, gangsters usually don't use guns like they might in other countries. Instead, they rely on their fists and whatever else they can get their hands on. Being tough and ready to fight is a big part of being in these gangs. Kita's story is pretty common. He grew up during a tough time in Japan's economy, finding it hard to get a good job. This led him and many young people like him to turn to crime. Kita ended up in prison for 2.5 years for aggravated assault. Now that he's out, he's trying to find his place in his gang, proving himself by fighting in underground matches. These gangs offer more than just a chance to make trouble, they provide a sense of family and belonging. For guys like Kita, who struggled to find their way, being part of a gang gives them a community and a purpose. This often starts in places like local gyms, which are not just spots to train but also places where gang leaders scout for new talent. All of this adds up to a Yakuza that's under more pressure than ever. Today, the Yakuza are hitting some tough times. Their numbers are dropping and their influence isn't what it used to be. This is all thanks to some serious legal crackdowns and big changes in society's views about them. It's really interesting to look at the Yakuza's journey. Their story shows just how tangled crime, culture, and economics can be in Japan. Now, With the world paying more attention and everything becoming more connected, you have to wonder what's next for them. How will they fit into a world that's watching them more closely than ever before? The Yakuza's story, from their dramatic rise to their potential decline, is a powerful reminder of how deeply organized crime can entangle itself in a society's very core. Over the centuries, they've not just been criminals on the sidelines, they've shaped culture, turned politics, and impacted the economy in profound ways. It is evidence of their permanent influence and the fine part they have played in Japanese history. If you want more content like this, please subscribe and don't forget to like and share. Thanks for watching Crime Republic.